I call what I said this morning Christian hedonism. Christian hedonism. Some people pronounce it hedonism. Now, I know that the word hedonism has a very negative connotation for most people, which it probably should, because it refers to things like worldliness, sensuality, selfishness, egotism. And I don't mean any of those things when I use the word. When I put Christian on the front of it, I want it to be transformed. So years and years ago, when I was considering, do I want to call this message Christian hedonism, I looked up the word hedonism in my high school dictionary, basic dictionary. And the first definition was a life devoted to pleasure. And I thought, that's exactly what I mean. A life devoted to the pursuit of pleasure. That's what I was talking about this morning. But of course, the world means pleasure in money, pleasure in success, pleasure in power. And when I put the word Christian on the front of it, I mean pleasure in God, according to Psalm 16:11. In your presence is fullness of joy, at your right hand are pleasures forevermore. That's what I mean by it. So I am an advocate for what I call Christian hedonism. And the reason I am emphasizing it here in this conference is because the theme of the conference, I was told in a word, would be holiness, or Philippians chapter 2, verses 15, where we are to shine like lights in the world and be blameless children of God in a crooked and perverse generation. And I thought, the only way I know to kill sin in my life is to kill it with the power of a superior pleasure. That's my understanding of sanctification. It won't do any good just to say to people, stop sinning. That won't work. The reason I sin, the reason you sin, is because it feels good to sin. Nobody sins out of duty. Nobody gets up in the morning and says, it is my obligation to sin today. Nobody does that. The reason we sin is because it's pleasurable. It feels good. My life will be happier if I sin. Now, how are you gonna conquer that? Tell people happiness doesn't matter? Of course it matters. It's all over the Bible. So the reason I'm talking about it is because this conference is about holiness. It's about being bright and distinct and radical Christian people in a pagan culture like yours and mine. And I believe the key is to be so miraculously transformed by God into the kind of people who find more pleasure in God than we do in sin, that we get victory over the sin in our lives. Let's go back 73 years. So I was born into a family, Bill and Ruth Piper, my parents. My father was an evangelist. My mother was a homemaker. I have one older sister. It was a sweet, happy, godly Christian home. And I had nothing to do with that. Isn't that amazing? That was total grace. I think my father was the happiest man I've ever known, which is an amazing statement. And my mother was joyfully supportive as he traveled all over the United States, preaching the gospel, leading people out of darkness into light. And I admired my father my whole life. He's in heaven today. And I never once resented my father's travels. He was at home maybe 1/3 of my growing up life. And the rest of the time he was on the road preaching. And I never resented that. And I think probably the reason I didn't resent it is because my mother didn't resent it. If my mother had been angry, I probably would have been angry. My mother loved my father. She loved his ministry. She supported it with all her heart. And so I cannot deny that one of the huge reasons I'm talking about joy 70 years later is because my father was the most joyful man I've ever known. And he loved God with all of his heart. There was a second impulse in the home. So this joy was pervasive, right? I mean, can you imagine having parents and you're a child sitting in the back seat of the car and you're going on a vacation and your parents are in the front seat of the car singing to Jesus, singing in the car. What a privilege. So the other emphasis was both my father and my mother would write letters to me while I was in college, seminary, graduate school over in Germany. And the end of their letters, they would write very often, Johnny, never forget, whether you eat or whether you drink, do all to the glory of God. 1 Corinthians 10:31. Well, when I left home at age 18 to go to university and study literature, these two forces, I want to be happy. My parents are happy. I want to be happy. And I want to glorify God because the Bible says I should. And I could not, at that time, put the two together. I didn't know how they fit. I wasn't sure whether it was completely right to want to be happy. I mean, happiness was okay if it kind of snuck up on you. But should you pursue it? Should you want it? And I wasn't sure. I knew I should want this one, the glory of God. I knew I couldn't stop wanting this one. You can't stop wanting to be happy. You can't. God has wired you in this room, and it isn't sinful wiring. God has wired you to want to be happy. And that's a good thing. So I went off to college, and at the end of the university 4 years, I still hadn't figured it out. But I knew I wanted to know this book, teach or preach this book. So at age 22, I go off to seminary, California, in Pasadena, California. And in those 3 years, between age 22 and 25, 1968 to 1971, my whole world changed. My vision of God, my understanding of his sovereignty, my understanding of joy, my understanding of his glory. I remember saying to my wife, because I got married in 1968, I remember saying to Noelle, as our lives were being turned upside down by these things I'm going to talk about in a minute, I said, Noelle, you know how you can tell that your world and your understanding of God is being revolutionized? By the way you pray. I wanted to pray with my wife. I've always prayed with my wife. I think that's why we're still married. Every night we're praying together. Every morning we're praying together. But oh, how differently I was praying in those days. I mean, hallowed be thy name was not a wasted phrase anymore. The number one request of every prayer: make your name great. Make your name great in this world. Hallowed be your name. So 3 influences came into my life: Daniel Fuller, C.S. Lewis, Jonathan Edwards. Daniel Fuller, you don't know him. He was a professor of mine. C.S. Lewis, you may know, the British writer, Christian writer. He died on the very same day that John F. Kennedy died. And Jonathan Edwards was an 18th century preacher in America. And those influences were gigantic. And let me just try to explain how they were. I was standing in a bookstore